don't, just leave it. I'll fix it.
Okay. All right. So as you can see from like the language that's used in this video, they're utilizing. So Nina says, "Altogether we become extraordinary." But more interestingly, I think, is you didn't see their like superhero names here because they don't have superhero names, and I think that's interesting. And some characters and heroes try to use superhero names, but it usually doesn't pan out. So I think that's interesting too, like the fact that they don't have the split identities is important. So as we can see in this video that highlights these characters' abilities, we see hints of who these people are as everyday people. Their powers have downsides, as Dr. Rosen says in the first episode. So when they're not working, then their abilities very quickly hinder their normal functions. So Gary is a high-functioning autistic individual, and you can definitely see that in his home life when like he has to measure his milk portion particularly, and he only eats like 1 scoop of cereal and things like that. So most of the characters like Gary, Rachel, and Bill, their disabilities are quickly guessed at. So Bill has heart conditions because he's always pumping the adrenaline. But mostly the characters' abilities produce other disabilities like drug and alcohol abuse, which is what we're going to see with Nina and Cameron in the future. That's what happens. Most interestingly, this can be very clearly seen when we think about Dr. Rosen, although not an alpha like Professor X would be if he was in this show. He also functions in a completely different manner than Professor X. So Dr. Rosen is their therapist. Often then the characters' at-home issues are actually brought into the work environment. This elimination of the border between the home and work is also an elimination of the border between their super abilities and disabilities. Moreover, although the episodes usually start at the start of the workday and end at the end of the assignment/workday, we often see them at home in their natural environments with their parents or their significant others. So at one instance, we see Rachel, who's in this traditional, I think, Iranian family, and I guess maybe I'll leave that. So she's in this traditional Iranian family, so her parents are trying to find her like a husband, but they say that her condition doesn't allow for her to find a husband, and she hears this as she's walking out the door because of her super hearing. And then we see Gary, who I think is very obviously autistic and throughout the show, as he, doesn't know how to function with other people than the people who he's used to. So I can answer questions after for anybody else, but I'll end right now.
5 minutes.
Oh, I'm good. I'm good.
I didn't mean to.
No, that's fine.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Here, sorry.
Did I mess things up?
Yeah, that's okay.
I'm sorry.
You're
Not a big deal. It's easily fixed.
And you gave us a 5-minute window to fix it, so you. Very good shape. Well, I already introduced William, so
yes, that is.
I could do it again while we're killing some time, in case we forgot. He's an associate professor of English and chair of interdisciplinary studies, or just interdisciplinary studies at Beacon College. And his presentation is Everyone But Me Seems to Be Growing, Ben, Laura, and Representations of Disability in Craig Thompson's Politics. And that worked out perfectly.
All right, wonderful, thank you. Scott McCloud notes that it's considered normal in this society for children to combine words and pictures so long as they grow out of it. This is a judgment and an assumption that even the comic book companies themselves made. For example, to get a sense of target audience, let's look at the advertisements for Marvel's Fantastic Four number 211 from October 1979. Present are ads for Battlestar Galactica toys. Hold on a second. Sorry. Let's get through something. Well, that's what we got. Present are, as for Battlestar Galactica toys, 132 plastic Roman soldiers, various novelties such as X-ray vision specs and spy pen radio, a home study course for law enforcement, fruit stripe and Hubba Bubba bubblegum, bodybuilding systems, and most tellingly, free information about a high school diploma and ring available through home study. In essence, toys and candy for the youngsters, systems promising physical enhancements for the image-conscious adolescents, and study courses for the teenagers who have flunked or dropped out of school, perhaps because they spend too much time reading comic books. Thus, it is almost daring for any comic-based work to discuss or include disability within its pages. Blankets is one such work, although disability does not immediately seem to be one of its themes. Craig Thompson's Blankets focuses on the brief but intense and ultimately failed relationship between high school teenagers Craig and Raina. But various members of their respective families also play important roles, such as Laura and Ben, Raina's adopted sister and brother. These are out of order somehow. All right, well, that's supposed to be interaction. Oh, here we go. Maybe. What is happening? All right. Give me just a second here. 4. Well, maybe they'll all catch up. Although Laura is 19 and Ben is 26, their behaviors are not entirely age appropriate, and it is obvious they have mental disabilities. For example, when we first encounter Laura, she comes sprawling through the door and communicates through noises rather than words. She is, however, extremely friendly, unlike Ben, who is standoffish with Craig, but can communicate with words and does not have the same delays in physical coordination. He can, for example, help his father load his truck with wood. Raina explains that the year after I was born, my parents adopted Ben and Laura as an act of gratitude. She says that Laura still wears diapers, still crawls, she's stunning more than she should be, and it makes my parents feel like failures. All right, maybe we're catching up here. Raina recounts that Laura was rescued from a family that abused her and moved to a family that pampered and sheltered her. In some cases, overprotective parents can be just as harmful as negligent ones, she concludes. Laura scoots around on the floor and communicates through various sounds. Affectionate and outgoing, she is far from independent. Ben, on the other hand, can communicate with words, is much more physically coordinated than Laura. However, he also has his emotional and social limitations. He distrusts strangers and is standoffish and aloof with Craig, refusing to even speak to him and even leaving the room when he enters. Incidentally, one cannot help but think of the character Benji Thompson from Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. That's in case you're wondering what the dog's slow, how that connected. Thompson's Ben and Laura share characteristics with Benji. Ben shares the name and gender of Benji, while Laura seems to have some of the more severe developmental difficulties like Benji. Presumably neither Ben nor Laura will ever be capable of living independently from a family member. As if to underscore that Laura has a disability, there is the image of her in a wheelchair. If the novel has not already made it clear, it is now unmistakable that she has handicaps. The International Symbol of Access, or International Wheelchair Symbol, designed in 1968 and adopted in 1969, is one of the 5 most recognized symbols in the world. Since the idea of the symbol was to increase access, it was decided that public education promotion, as opposed to patenting, would be more effective in ensuring that the symbol would always be kept in the public domain. Craig makes several comments regarding Laura's disabilities. For example, when Raina combs Laura's hair, Craig observes that when the matted bedhead was teased out, her locks were lush and silky, and when she stopped moving, sedated by the meditative ritual, she didn't look retarded at all. Craig theorizes then that the outward characteristics we use to identify mental disability have less to do with physical features than with motor coordination. Craig goes on to describe her skin, eyes, lips, and features, concluding that when she held still, Laura was absolutely beautiful. Although Craig is overly simplistic in establishing his diagnostic criteria, he is correct that one of the defining characteristics the average person often looks for in identifying developmental disabilities are the potential differences in physical coordination. The difficulties and inconsistencies with establishing a consistent definition for mental retardation is an issue Alison Friedman takes up. She says there is currently great variation between cultures in defining the level of mental functioning that constitutes retardation. Not only do definitions of mental retardation vary widely from country to country, but some countries conflate mental illness with mental retardation and often completely exclude mental retardation from their definition. Further complicating the matter is the fact that at the broadest level, mental disability, mental disorder, and mental illness are often used as all-encompassing terms. Within the category of mental disorders, some clinicians also differentiate further, indicating that within mental disorders there are two types of disorders: process disorders and development disorders. Friedman explains that process disorders are generally called mental illnesses, and they exist when the illness is a result of an event that changes an individual's behavior. Thus, these mental illnesses are not a continuous state of mental illness, but generally cause episodes of the disease. In contrast, development disorders, however, are inherent to the person and do not appear in episodes but are perpetual. Mental retardation is generally classified as a development disorder, concludes Friedman, since it always affects the individual. The distinction, for example, is that a mentally retarded person is always mentally retarded, whereas a person with a diagnosis of depression may not always be depressed. The terms we use to describe the condition have fluctuated over the years. One of the earliest terms to describe the currently used term intellectual disability, or the broader developmental disability, was the term cretin. Other terms and labels followed, sometimes simultaneously employed, to describe severity, onset of condition, and IQ. These include dementia, young, dementia, old, idiot, mental age less than 2, imbecile, which is less severe than idiocy, moron, mental age 8 to 12, Mongolism, which was Down syndrome, educable, IQ 50 to 75, trainable, IQ below 50, and retarded, a word used to replace idiot, imbecile, and moron that originally was not derogative. We see an abbreviated history of the terminology in blankets when one child says to Ben, "Hey retard." Another child corrects him and says the proper term is mongoloid, while yet another says he's a downy. In addition, naming the condition, yeah, that's right, this rhymes. Defining mental retardation has also been problematic. In America, for example, the term continues to undergo revision. Friedman reports that the DS5 makes several changes from the previous edition, including changing the term mental retardation to intellectual disability. Not only the term itself, but its identifying characteristics have been modified, including moving the focus away from strict IQ cutoffs to focus on impairment of general mental abilities that impact adaptive functioning, and removing the age cutoff for the development of symptoms, and instead indicating that the symptoms must begin during the developmental period. Not only are there numerous conflicting definitions within the United States, but Friedman reports that various countries also have different ways of recognizing or ignoring mental retardation. These include countries that define only mental illness, countries that conflate the definitions for mental illness and mental retardation, countries that differentiate between mental illness and mental retardation, and finally, countries that provide no definition for either mental illness or mental retardation. Consequently, Friedman recommends a definition whose language includes the following aspects: language concerning mental incapacity with regard to cognitive functioning, language regarding how an individual's mental defect originated, language regarding the extent of the mental defect, and lastly, language describing the ways in which a mental defect may affect an individual's functioning. After surveying and synthesizing various definitions from around the world, Friedman recommends a global definition of mental retardation as a significant cognitive disability or arrested development of the mental faculties, whether hereditary or acquired, that substantially impairs judgment, reasoning, volition, or adaptive behavior. Beyond difficulties in definition, problems and complexities pervade the representation of both mental and physical disability. No pity, people with disabilities forging a new civil rights movement by Joseph P. Shapiro contains an enlightening section titled Disabling Images that skims over images, representations, and terminology from the Old Testament to the 1990s relating to people with disability. Shapiro states that in popular culture one can find constant description of a disabled person's proper role as either an object of pity or a source of inspiration. He points to characters such as Tiny Tim as examples. More common is to see an author exaggerate a disability as an emblem of a character's sinister, evil, or morally flawed nature. Examples include Lindy of Mice and Men, Freddy Krueger, and various versions of Joker and Penguin from the Batman universe. Shapiro locates one source of these types of portrayals in Christianity. He explains that in the Old Testament, being blind, lame, deaf, crippled, sick, or diseased is a sign of having done something to incur God's disfavor. In short, disabilities brought on by sin. In the New Testament, people with disabilities are cursed or possessed by evil, he summarizes. Although many people have moved on from that sort of thinking, our understanding of disability is still incomplete, if not flawed. Susan M. Squire, in response to the question, what is disability, says that until the late 1980s, that question was answered primarily in medical terms. This definition led to the creation of institutions that constructed individuals with disabilities as inferior, abnormal, and incapable of participation. In the portrayal of mental disability in children's literature, Claudia Mills surveys a number of works and concludes that while it is understandable that an author would try to convey the message that although a disabled character lacks one kind of value, he or she compensates for this by having more of another kind of value, so that we all end up equal in some sense in the end. Mills explains that this widely adopted strategy ends up reinforcing rather than challenging a fundamentally competitive view of what it is to be a person with value. The implication then is that it is not enough for someone to just be. They must be special in some way and be able to compensate for their perceived and labeled deficiencies so that everything balances out. Blankets partially avoids this trap. Ben does not seem to be special in any particular way. Craig says that Laura's personality is so sweet and affectionate, and throughout the novel we see examples of her fun-loving spirit and friendly nature that manifests itself immediately even with strangers such as Craig. Mill says that a problematic message also common to many books featuring mentally disabled characters is that while the mentally disabled character may have less intelligence in terms of measurable IQ, he or she has more of something else, usually more heart, more soul, more compassion to others. This description seems to sum up Laura. Laura and Ben show us two extremes, gregarious and aloof, very extroverted and severely introverted. Thus, according to Mills's argument, the portrayal of Ben seems unfair because it is so flat, and the portrayal of Laura seems unfair because it compensates for Laura's disability by pointing out her sunny disposition. Yet in what circumstances is it fair to portray a character with disabilities as affable? Is it then unfair to show Ben as distanced, even sullen at times and occasionally angry? Are we mistaking average for normal, flatness of effect for acceptable behavior? The novel gives no instructions regarding how to distinguish between disability and personality. Or does it? Raina seems quite people-oriented and Craig quite the opposite. As best we can tell, they do not have any disabilities, certainly none as severe or pervasive as those of Ben and Laura. We never find out what happens to Ben or Laura. Spread throughout the novel are several segments involving a monkey. Raina asks Laura, "You want to wear your monkey sweatshirt?" A few panels later, she refers to Laura as a monkey when she says, "Look at your hair, monkey." Thus, the novel establishes a connection between Laura and a monkey. Referring to her parents, Laura speculates that I don't think they were prepared for the long run, for Laura growing up and still being a child. Further on, Raina recounts the story of a family pet that her family once cared for. Their Capuchin monkey named Snowball was disruptive. For example, Raina remembered creating a child's banquet using a blanket for a table and pillows for chairs. Snowball was difficult, throwing, stealing, and finally dismantling the entire table. Later, when Craig asked whatever happened to Snowball, Raina explains that her parents returned him to the pet store one day without telling us. Too much to handle. If we ponder the significance of the anecdote and connect all these sections together, they imply that Laura is like Snowball, difficult to handle. Unlike Snowball, Laura cannot be returned. We do not know if her parents would even choose such an option if it existed. However, with the dissolution of Laura's family imminent, one wonders about her eventual fate. The last we hear of her comes from a phone conversation between Craig and Raina. We only hear his side of the conversation. He says, "Thank you. Taking care of Laura too, geez, that's a lot of responsibility." Perhaps Raina has shifted into the role of primary caretaker. Thus, the novel raises but does not answer the long-term question of what ultimately happens to individuals with disabilities severe enough to prevent independent living. William Cuskin says that the origin story, the broken protagonist who transforms himself, is the true meaning of the genre of the graphic novel. Perhaps this is one reason Ben and Laura seem such tragic characters. The novel portrays them as stunted or broken, and they are incapable of transformation. Ben is stuck in adolescence, and Laura remains frozen in early childhood. On the other hand, as we have seen, all of these characters have some issue. Raina's mother sits ingesting various prescription medications. She asks Raina to please write this note to your father for me, suggesting that perhaps she too has some sort of a disability. Additionally, although there are no easy passages from childhood through adolescence to adulthood, we wonder whether Craig's transition is especially difficult. We might be able to make some sort of a case for a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, essentially a milder, more functional, whatever functional might mean, version of autism. At the very least, he may suffer from some level of social anxiety disorder. Raina seems to have boundary issues. Her father is disengaged from the family. To some degree, all of these characters struggle with something. Mill says that the message that I think is most true to the moral reality is that we are all differently abled in different kinds of ways. None of us is normal. Thank you. And don't press anything, right?
Thank you to all of our presenters. Questions now. We should have about, if I check the schedule here, we go to 4:20, so almost 20 minutes.
Yes. I have a question for Asmaa.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry if I butchered that.
No, you didn't.
So I have you talk about alphas, which I was also very pissed off when they canceled it, because they left it on cliffhanger. But I was wondering, because you talked, like you started off your discussion about the sort of echolocation system that I know some of the deaf people have, or not deaf, blind people have started employing. Yeah. And there's just sort of discussion that you talk about, like the sort of passing narrative. Do you think that there's a reason why it seems like the superheroes, and especially those alphas, have these sort of invisible disabilities? And the only way you can really tell has a sort of severe, or not severe, but something that's at least identifiable as scary. And I'm wondering why, or how you think that functions within like a comic book superhero narrative, because it seems like you mentioned Mystique, because she has the ability to pass. So in a way, she has the ability to make her disability, or what is really, I think, just a physical alteration, invisible, versus someone like Nightcrawler who can't do that, and what kind of effect that has.
You mean in general?
Yeah, I was just wondering, because it's like, I know it's a really broad question.
No, yeah, no, I think, I was also wondering about Nightcrawler, because obviously he can't change his skin color, right? So I
or
think...
his tail.
What?
Or his tail.
Or his tail, that's true. Or his various body morphisms. So I think, I haven't really thought about Nightcrawler beyond that superficial, like he can't do what Mystique does, and that she can obviously disguise herself. But I think, because I remember when I was younger, I used to watch that show with like the teenage. Yeah, there you go. So I think if I'm remembering correctly, I don't think they even like talked about the fact that he had blue skin. They just like let it. They were just like, okay, that's cool. You've got blue skin.
They kind of had such an easy out with it. Like,
Yeah.
They gave him the watch and then he
they just kind of erased it. And
Oh, that's true. That's what they did.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they gave him like a mechanical thing that made him look human. But yeah, I guess that would be the answer, that they gave him that watch. But yeah, I think Mystique is an interesting character in that in order to hide her disability, she's actually presenting her disability, right? Because the way that she's masking is utilizing her powers.
Well, I mean, what I mean is like, do you think, why do you think it is like that? It seems way more palpable for us to display, like have these sort of superheroes with like invisible disabilities. Like we could take somebody like Superman, which on Smallville he didn't want to have sex with Lana because he was afraid that he would kill her. But like there's this sort of like fear for these sort of, but it's way more palpable when it's done with like really good looking people that you cannot tell, you know. Is that like a sort of, do you think that there's a, have you seen like a change, do you think, in the representation, or you think it's still like that?
No, I do think that they have to look otherwise normal, right? So like Gary can't have like another eye right here or something, right? Because that won't work out for the narrative. So I think even though it's interesting that Alpha's, you know, that represents those kinds of disabilities, they also don't go as far as to make them have blue skin or tails or whatever. So I think maybe like a super progressive show would be like would have both of those features installed in their like narrative arc. But yeah, I think it's progressed in some ways, but at the same time there's some issues still. Yeah.
My question is also for Asmaa, although it sort of has two bits, and one of it sort of crosses over into Natalie's area. And so one of them is just in terms of this sort of relationship between like superability and disability. I was wondering if you've read the Grant Morrison run on Doom Patrol, and if so, what do you think about that? Because for them, for the characters in that, like literally their superpowers are their disabilities. There's like no difference between them whatsoever, and so their daily lives are fundamentally.
I have not. What is that called again?
Doom Patrol.
The Grant Morrison run is really, really good.
Yeah.
I think you'd be really interested in it.
Yeah, I will check that out. Thank you.
There is actually like no line between those things.
Okay,
in that.
great. That would be perfect.
That was part of Doom Patrol way before Grant Morrison,
Yeah.
beginning of the series in '63.
Cool. Yeah, I'll check. Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to ask her was you brought up heroes, and I haven't seen Alpha, so I can't really comment on that. But one of the things that you didn't mention that I think is really interesting, particularly in relation to what you were talking about with Hawkeye and how that ends up being represented, and particularly in resistance in that issue to the sort of the Daredevil, like, you must also develop super ability elsewhere to like completely negate whatever disability. I would think early on when Sylar is like collecting abilities from a bunch of people, when he collects super hearing, it's from someone who actually does experience her super hearing, like the surfeit of ability as disability, and has to constantly play loud music to block it out. And so I'm kind of interested in that, particularly in relation to that sort of narrative that's resisting, on the one hand, this narrative that's resisting, on the one hand, like that really common trope of you develop super abilities elsewhere to compensate from a disability in one area, but then also that sort of ability that when it's augmented, it prevents itself, right? Like you hear so much that you cannot hear because hearing it becomes painful.
Yeah, I think that's also just to bring in Alpha's conversation. I think that's present in Rachel's powers, right? Because her powers are like very augmented in a way that, as they said in that trailer, once she starts using one of her senses, all the other ones like are gone, right? So she can no longer hear, she can no longer smell or whatever. She's just seeing. So I think that's a similar issue that happens in that, like, when you increase when they're utilizing their powers so much, it kind of like eliminates the other powers. But with the hero's character that you're mentioning, I think that's an interesting shift in that he's using his powers to eliminate his powers, right? Because the reason he listens to loud music all the time is so that he can block out all the other sounds that he's hearing, right? So I think that's an interesting side to the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, overcorrecting is a thing that doesn't really happen in Hawkeye yet. I can foresee it maybe showing up in all new Hawkeye with Iron Man's super hearing aid that no one can see, but is definitely there, but apparently grows in size when he needs to look for it. I can definitely foresee that happening. But with Hawkeye, what's interesting is that he is not a super-powered superhero. He's much more of your average man who just decides to pick up arrows, which we actually see Fraction explore in the rest of the run, because he is always bandaged. Like there's all those cosplayers who like to roleplay as Hawkeye with the bandage over his nose or things like that. So I don't foresee that happening with Hawkeye, but yeah, it would be interesting to see, I guess.
I'm going to jump in just real quick, and I'm going to come to you, just something to throw out there for people. Hawkeye also seems to struggle from depression, or with depression rather, and I've even seen like articles theorizing of perhaps diagnosis of bipolar for him. And so to have a character who's not super abled and has multiple disabilities, it would be really interesting to see how that develops.
He's very human, especially in Fraction for him. Which is his main appeal for people who don't like superhero comics. Hawkeye is very not superhero-y very much at all. So it pulls all comic book fans from everywhere.
Yeah, in that regard, I think it's doing something that Frank Miller was doing with Daredevil, who's also not super powered except for the senses, but not powerful. And it had a really high element, a very strong element of noir and crime comics more than superheroes. A quick comment on this issue of assimilation. It seems to me that it ties into some other areas of like assimilation of other races or ethnicities or creeds, where there is this sense of like there's a kind of a limit up to one point one will be different, and I think you say that in something like Alphas. You still have to look great, you still have to look basically like everybody else. But a couple of questions, one for, and they both have to do with comics representation of disability, which I both with William's paper and with Natalie's I thought was very interesting. Number one, Natalie, for you, you mentioned those episodes in Hawkeye when you have a jagged word balloon meant to evoke some kind of anger or some kind of frustration that Barney is exhibiting. And what I find really bizarre about that is that that's essentially saying, isn't it, that there's something about those speech balloon that is containing something other than sound.
Yes.
Because otherwise, because we've established that Bart can't hear him, therefore whatever anger is contained has to be coming out of something. Is that a problem? Is that a kind of ableist kind of take on representing his deafness? Hold on that. The other one for William was, I was captivated by this description that you kind of focus on, where I think the name is Laura, the woman who's mentally retarded. This idea that Thompson puts out there that when she doesn't move, when she's still, she's actually very beautiful, something like that. And what I found remarkable about that in a kind of metatextual sense is that, of course, comics are always still. Right. Comics are static. So is there maybe a way in which comics representation can maybe make those aspects of disability as beautiful, in this case, maybe more apparent? So those are my two questions.
Whichever one of you wants to.
I think it is partially a problematic representation, because obviously it would be different if it was young Clint who's hard of hearing. You could maybe sense a difference in tone in the voice or something of that nature, whereas adult Clint who is fully deaf can't hear anything, so how are these word balloons having a jagged effect? But I think there are other ways to see how people are speaking. I think that's what Fraction is trying to say that Clint is picking up on. Barney's body language and his facial expressions every time we see those jagged verb balloons are very angry or tense, or he's obviously yelling, his mouth is open super loud or something like that. The only exception I can think of is in one of the first panels I showed where Clint is out of the car already when we see Barney using one of those jagged verb balloons. And since Clint is not there to filter our experience, it does seem a bit weird that we're seeing that as a reader who is assumed to be hearing. It is interesting to see that unfiltered through Clint's eyes. But I think it has negatives and positives.
It's a bizarre synesthetic kind of redefinition of what a word balloon really is.
Yeah.
It's something that goes beyond just communicating speech, it seems, or oral speech.
Yeah.
Does it speak to the reader, to the receiver of the speech, or is it speaking just for Barney? Is the speech bubble merely about Barney's vocal expression, not requiring a hearing audience? Is Barney just verbalizing for his own sake, knowing his brother isn't going to listen anyway?
I mean, it once again goes back to context, right? So we know that Barney is being frustrated. We know that he's been trying to communicate with Clint, and not only is Clint refusing to communicate back with him, but Barney's communication isn't fully being communicated to the reader. So it's a very frustrating comic, even when you're reading it, and that is fully the intention of the comic, to be frustrating.
I'm going to go ahead and dare to rewrite Fraction. Maybe it might have worked better if instead of the speech balloon being jagged, the panel border had been jagged.
Yeah,
that might communicate that frustration without having to resort to sound,
right.
or what we associate with sound.
Yeah, I would say with blankets, one of the first things it does is maybe it makes us look at these characters, because I think the instinct sometimes that we kind of have, or that we're taught, is when you come across folks that are different in some way, you either just ignore them because you're taught, it's not polite to stare, or maybe, as kids, maybe we kind of stare out of the corner of our eye, and we seem less successful having that middle ground of just, seeing someone and just saying, smiling or saying, hey, as you would to anyone else. So I think first the fact that it makes it harder to ignore these characters in the narrative, just the fact that they're in there is a positive step. The other thing I think is that for the most part, Blind Kids is presented